How to fly the helicopter or any object in the direction you want. A straight direction, a vertical direction. A down direction, a circle direction. Any variety of direction possible. Follow this tutorial. And I guarantee it will be easy. Let's go. In Moviestorm, we place ourselves in the director's view. The space in which we perform all kinds of actions of our film. Once in the director's view, I remind you to focus on the path of the helicopter and the timeline at the bottom. Because this is where you will better understand what is happening. For a rectilinear movement of the helicopter, you drag the helicopter and you place it where you want. You will notice that automatically Moviestorm draws the path of the movement of the helicopter in the timeline. At the bottom, not only that but at the same time, it also draws the path of the movement of the helicopter by drawing red arrows in the workspace. To allow you to locate yourself in your movement with the helicopter. As you can see the red arrows indicating the direction of movement. For now, we just have a basic rectilinear motion. But to do a helicopter takeoff, we place the cursor in the timeline between the two ends of the movement as you see on the screen. You place the time cursor anywhere but inside the two ends of the movement to adjust the takeoff movement. At the same time you will see the result in the workspace. Note that if you keep the time slider at the end of the movement in the timeline and move the helicopter while dragging it, the helicopter will continue to take off upwards. There you can see in red arrows the trip that we have just made when taking off the helicopter. Each time you want to edit the movement and customize this takeoff, you have to place the time cursor in the timeline between the two ends of the movement. And then move the helicopter or point it in the direction you like. You will have a variety of helicopter movements. Now we have succeeded in making the helicopter take off vertically but in place. But to make it take off vertically but while moving forward. So for that, we place the time cursor in the timeline just before the end of the movement in the timeline. To ensure the continuity of our movement. So once the time cursor in the timeline is placed just before the end of the movement, you drag the helicopter and place it where you want while moving forward. You will then notice that the helicopter will take off, but moving forward as you can see on the screen. Otherwise, if you place the cursor outside and after the movement in the timeline, in this case, you will go to another movement distinct from the first movement. Very well. We made our helicopter take off as we wanted, and now we want the helicopter to continue its flight, but in horizontal rectilinear movement. For this you have to be careful in placing the time cursor in the timeline, because you have to place the cursor outside the first movement of the takeoff after the end of the first movement, otherwise the helicopter will continue to take off upwards. Then once you place the cursor outside the first movement in the timeline, you drag the helicopter and you move it in the direction that suits you. You will notice at the helicopter after the air takeoff, it straightens and continues its straight path horizontal. You will also notice that there are now two movements in the timeline, and there is an empty space between them. This empty space creates a helicopter pause. If you want to remove it, you pick up the second movement in the timeline and you bring it closer to the first movement, until the two movements are glued. Okay. We managed to get our helicopter off the ground and fly it through the sky. So now, we're going to learn how to land it. The first landing way I'm going to show you is a normal and simple landing. Remember that each time you want a different movement of the helicopter, you have to place the cursor in the timeline after the previous movement. Then we place the cursor as I indicated and we drag the helicopter and we bring it down to the ground. And we release. You see that the helicopter landed normally in vertical, but it turned by itself when it landed. But that's okay, don't panic. To straighten it to its front position, you place the cursor in the timeline just before the end of the landing movement and you drag the helicopter and point it towards its forward position as I show you on the screen. Now assuming you want a more spectacular landing, we will delete the movement of the landing. Now, we will make a crash-style landing. So we now have a rectilinear aerial movement in the timeline. We then place the cursor before the end of this movement in the timeline and we drag the helicopter and we bring it back to the ground vertically. You will then see that the helicopter begins to land in crash style. You can experiment with other landing styles by placing the cursor in the middle of the movement in the timeline to get the landing style that works best for you. Now if you want the helicopter to straighten up and return to its normal position on the ground, you place the cursor outside of the landing motion. And you move the helicopter in one direction, and in this way the helicopter straightens up and comes out of the way its crash. Don't forget to eliminate gaps between movements in the timeline to remove time pauses between movements. As you can see, the path of the helicopter is visible to help you find your way in space. Of course, you can customize each movement in the timeline, each time placing the cursor in a different place from the movement in the timeline and making the helicopter move or turn it or make it descend or raise it, to get exactly what you want. All movements and orientations are possible. Now assuming you want a circular motion of the helicopter. It is also easy to do that. First you make a straight rectilinear movement of the helicopter, as you can see. In the timeline you will have a movement that will help us to customize the movement in circular. Then place the cursor after the start of the movement. And we will make the straight movement in circular movement. Then we move the helicopter, as you see on the screen, to find a circular shape. The red arrows representing the path of the helicopter help us see what we are drawing as a shape. As we move the helicopter, then we obtain a semicircular. And to finish the other circular half, we create a new rectilinear motion. And we customize it as in the procedure of the first circular half. And if you want a perfectly circular shape, you can simply put a circular object. And you carry out the movements by locating yourself thanks to this circular object. That will give you a perfectly circular movement. Now we take off like a tiger that jumps ready for battle. We first place the cursor in the timeline outside the previous movement. Then we move the helicopter upwards, then we release. Then we move the helicopter again, this time to the right or to the left. Or forwards or backwards. In this example I move it to the right, then I release. Then we get this helicopter takeoff effect. You can customize it even more according to your will if you understand the procedure. And once the helicopter has taken off, and you want it to continue flying normally in the horizon, you create a new movement of the helicopter by placing the cursor in the timeline outside of the previous movement. And you move the helicopter in the direction that suits you, so that the helicopter advances in the air in the normal position without tilting. If you want the helicopter to keep going up in the sky after the tiger takeoff, you must place the cursor in the timeline somewhere in the middle of the last movement. And you move the helicopter up. And you will have a vertical upward movement with the helicopter tail down. Now we will know how to adjust the speed of each movement. So if you want to advance the speed of the movement of the helicopter, in the timeline you enter with the last end of the movement that you want to modify the speed. And you narrow the length of this movement by dragging with the cursor, and then you release. This way you will have a higher speed. You can set the speed that suits you. And if you want to reduce the speed of a movement, You do the same procedure but in the opposite direction. You extend the length of the movement in the timeline as needed. As you can see the result on the screen. You can also customize the movement in the timeline using the different speed styles. Right-click in the timeline on a movement and choose the speed style that suits you.
Hello brothers Moviestormers. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you. If you liked it, don't hesitate to leave me your comments. And subscribe to my MLab 3D channel. Peace out brothers out there. And don't forget, never stop dreaming. Because all the great things began with a little dream. And inside each of you there are wonderful gifts. Have a nice time everybody. The world gets better when we help each other. Don't be a sterile seed. Let the earth bear your fruit.